Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. End of part 1. The days passed, and Mark found himself unable to shake the decision that weighed heavily on his mind. He had never imagined his life could change so quickly, and yet, Eleanor's offer was still fresh in his thoughts. The offer that had been impossible to refuse, no matter how crazy it seemed. The cold, rainy night when he agreed to marry her now felt like a distant memory, yet the consequences were rapidly approaching. As the time ticked by, Mark tried to push away the feelings of doubt creeping in. But everything around him reminded him of the promises he had made, promises he could no longer ignore. Eleanor had made it clear that she expected an answer. And that night, he had given it. He stood outside Brooks' Bistro again, rain drizzling down, his heart beating a little faster than it should have. The lights of the bistro cast a warm glow, and as he walked in, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the choice he was about to make. His feet carried him inside, where he found Eleanor waiting at the same corner table as before. She looked up as he approached, her cool composure unwavering. "You've made up your mind, then?" she asked, her voice steady, as though this was just another business transaction. She didn't look surprised, only more determined than ever. Mark swallowed hard. The decision that had seemed like the only option now felt like a burden he couldn't quite carry. "I'll do it," he said, his voice more certain than he felt. He knew that without this contract, without her offer, his future was uncertain. The weight of his family's debt and his responsibilities felt heavier than ever. "Good," Eleanor said simply, nodding in approval. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. This will be finalized quickly." She paused, studying him carefully. "There are rules, of course. No public displays of affection. No questions about my personal life, and most importantly, this is a marriage of convenience, nothing more." Mark nodded, unable to hide his confusion. "I understand," he replied, although part of him wondered what he had just agreed to. A marriage of convenience. He'd never imagined himself in such a situation. But he had no choice. He needed to secure his future and his mother's. "We will make this work," Eleanor continued, her voice warm yet distant. "It's a simple arrangement. You'll accompany me to public events, handle a few things for me in the business world. You'll have access to everything you need: money, status, opportunities." She leaned back in her chair, a glimmer of something in her eyes. "In return, you'll help me maintain the image I need. And in time, you may find there's more to this than just a contract." Mark felt a tightness in his chest at the way she said that last part. He wasn't sure what she meant, but it unsettled him. He had no illusions about what this marriage would be, just two people bound by an agreement. But as Eleanor spoke, he couldn't help but feel a faint flicker of something else. Was it curiosity? Or maybe something else entirely? After a moment of silence, Eleanor broke the stillness. "You'll meet my lawyer tomorrow," she said, standing up. "We'll go over the terms. And then, we'll begin." She handed him a business card with the time and place written on it. Mark took it, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. He couldn't deny the sudden jolt of electricity that ran through him at the brief contact. He quickly looked away, shaking off the sensation as best as he could. This was a business arrangement. Nothing more. As he left the bistro that night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life was no longer his own. He had walked into the restaurant a struggling law student, unsure of his future, and now he was walking out as a man who had agreed to marry a powerful, enigmatic woman. He wondered how much of his life would remain unchanged, and how much would be completely different. The next day, Mark met with Eleanor's lawyer as planned. He sat across from the polished desk in a sleek, modern office, feeling out of place in the luxurious surroundings. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, went over the terms of the contract with him, her tone businesslike and impersonal. "There are 3 main clauses," she explained, flipping through the papers. "First, no emotional attachment. Second, you will attend certain events as Mrs. Brooks's companion. And third, confidentiality. No one can know about this arrangement. You both agree to the terms, and the marriage will be recognized legally as a business contract only. Mark listened intently, signing the papers when she was done. His thoughts were a whirlwind, and he didn't know what to make of it all. He had always prided himself on his integrity, on doing things the right way. But now, he was about to sign away his freedom, his choices, for a chance at a life of security. His mother's medical bills, the looming debt, and the pressure to succeed all weighed heavily on his mind. And in the back of his thoughts, a small voice wondered whether he could ever truly escape the shadow of this contract. When he returned home, Mark couldn't bring himself to share the news with his mother. She would never understand. She would never know the lengths he had gone to secure a future for them both. He kept the secret, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. The next few days blurred together as he prepared for the life he had just committed to. He attended events with Eleanor, always playing the role of the doting husband. The public could never know the truth. And slowly, he started to feel like he was living a double life, one where he was trapped by the very choices he had made. As the weeks went on, the distance between Eleanor and Mark remained as cold as ever. He kept to his side of the arrangement, attending events, staying out of her personal life. But something had shifted. Eleanor, the woman who had seemed so calculated and composed, had begun to show glimpses of vulnerability that Mark couldn't ignore. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but he started to wonder, was there more to this marriage than either of them had bargained for? End of part 2. The weeks passed, and Mark began to adapt to his new life. He was no longer the struggling law student, but now he played the part of a husband, at least in public, of a wealthy and powerful woman. Eleanor's world was filled with high-end galas, charity events, and private business meetings. Every night, they attended another event together, each more extravagant than the last, and with each event, Mark felt more and more like a character in a story he had no part in writing. But it wasn't just the events. It was the way Eleanor looked at him sometimes, with a softness in her eyes that seemed out of place with the businesslike demeanor she had when they first met. It was the small gestures, the subtle touches, the moments when their eyes would meet across a crowded room, and for just a second, Mark would forget about the contract, about the arrangement, about everything. One evening, after a particularly long charity gala, they were walking through the grand foyer of a luxurious hotel. The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed in the quiet hall. Eleanor was walking just ahead of him, her silhouette framed by the soft lighting of the chandeliers. She was as graceful and composed as ever, but tonight, there was something different about her. Mark was exhausted, his mind still reeling from the speeches and the crowd. He caught up with her and, without thinking, reached out and touched her arm gently. She stopped, turning to him with a surprised but not entirely unwelcoming look. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. Mark hesitated. I don't know. I've been thinking about this, about everything." His voice trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. They had talked so much about their roles in this arrangement, but he had never really allowed himself to think about what it all meant. What was he really doing here? What was Eleanor really asking of him? Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "What are you asking, Mark?" she replied, her eyes searching his. For the first time, Mark didn't feel like he was just a part of the deal. He felt like he was looking at her not as a business partner, not as a woman he was contractually bound to, but as a person. And for the first time, he wondered if she might feel the same way. Was it possible that, behind the cold professionalism, there was something more? "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't know if this is what I expected." He paused, his gaze shifting as he gathered his thoughts. I didn't think I would start to care about this about us." He looked up at her then, a mix of uncertainty and something else in his eyes. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She just stood there, her gaze steady on him. Then, without a word, she reached for his hand and gave it a light squeeze. It was small, but the gesture spoke volumes. There was a vulnerability in her touch that Mark had never seen before. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I may have asked you into this arrangement, but that doesn't mean I don't care about how you feel." Mark's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly pushed the emotion down. this was still a contract, a business deal. They were not supposed to have feelings. But Eleanor's words echoed in his mind long after they had left the gala and returned to their shared apartment. The next few days were strange. Eleanor seemed more distant, but also more present. She wasn't cold or aloof, but she wasn't the same person she had been at the beginning. It was as though the lines between business and personal had started to blur, and neither of them knew how to navigate it. Mark continued to fulfill his role as her public husband, attending events with her, playing the part of the successful businessman's partner. But inside, he felt torn. Every time he saw Eleanor, his mind went back to the words she had said that night, "You're not alone in this." He didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't know how to respond to the part of him that was starting to care for her. Was this what she wanted? Was this what he wanted? Then one evening, as they sat together in their apartment after a long day, Eleanor turned to him with a different look in her eyes. There was something more in her gaze this time, something that held an unspoken question. "Mark," she said softly, "have you ever wondered what it would be like if this were real?" The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any contract or agreement they had signed. Mark's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he might say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded. He didn't know what to say, but he knew that for the first time, he didn't want to play the part anymore. He didn't want to be just a contract. He didn't want to be just a role he was playing in someone else's life. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he took it in his, and as their hands touched, he wondered if this was the moment they would both realize something much deeper was growing between them. End of Part 3. The days following the conversation were filled with tension and uncertainty. Mark couldn't shake the words Eleanor had said. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like if this were real?" It kept echoing in his mind, as if challenging him to see their situation through a different lens. He had agreed to this arrangement to secure his future, to help his mother, but now, he wasn't so sure. Was he merely fulfilling his role in a business deal, or had something deeper started to blossom between them? As he sat in their shared apartment later that week, Mark stared out the window, his thoughts racing. He could hear Eleanor moving around in the next room, her footsteps light and purposeful. It had been a quiet evening, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. They had spent hours at a charity auction earlier that day, smiling for the cameras, exchanging pleasantries with guests. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The way Eleanor had looked at him that night, they both knew things were changing. Mark was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of Eleanor's voice, soft but urgent, as she entered the room. "Mark," she began, her tone different now, more vulnerable than he had ever heard. She hesitated, clearly weighing her words before continuing. "I think it's time we talk about what happens next." His heart skipped a beat. He had known this conversation was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. Mark turned to face her, his mind still trying to process what he was feeling. He had spent so many years focused on survival, on securing a future, that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with someone. But now, with Eleanor, it felt as if that connection was becoming impossible to ignore. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. Eleanor walked closer, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of determination and something softer, something he hadn't noticed before. "I think we've both been pretending for a while now. Pretending that this marriage is just a contract. Just a business arrangement. But I'm starting to wonder if it's more than that." Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. He couldn't deny it anymore. He had started to care for her, more than he ever intended. But how could he admit that to her? How could he admit that he, too, was feeling something he didn't understand? "I'm not sure what to say," Mark replied, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "I never thought I'd be in this position. I didn't expect to feel anything." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a moment, she seemed to understand exactly what he meant. "Neither did I," she said quietly, almost as if talking to herself. "But here we are." She took a deep breath and then added, "Mark, I want to be honest with you. I didn't bring you into this arrangement just to fulfill a role. I saw something in you from the beginning. Something real." Mark's heart pounded as he processed her words. She was being vulnerable with him in a way that he hadn't expected, and it made his own walls begin to crumble. For the first time, he realized that maybe Eleanor was more than just a powerful, cold woman he had first met. Maybe she was someone he could trust. Maybe they could both trust each other. Before he could speak, Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what happens after this. I don't know what it means for us or for our future, but I can't keep pretending anymore. I want to know if there's a chance for something real between us, beyond this contract. Mark looked at her, his mind racing. His whole life, he had put his family and his future above everything else. But now, standing here in this moment with Eleanor, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than simply surviving. Maybe it was time to take a chance on something he had long forgotten: love. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed against hers. I don't know where this will go, he said, his voice low but steady, but I'm willing to find out. Eleanor's eyes softened, and she nodded, as if relieved by his response. They stood there for a moment, both of them uncertain about what lay ahead, but for the first time, the future didn't seem so daunting. It seemed full of possibility. As the night stretched on, they sat together in silence, the weight of their words hanging between them. Neither of them knew what the next step would be, but one thing was clear: the walls they had both built around their hearts were starting to come down. The contract they had signed was still in place, but in that moment, it felt less like a barrier and more like a foundation for something new. End of Part 4. The following days were filled with a quiet tension, as Mark and Eleanor navigated the new dynamic between them. They continued their public appearances, still presenting themselves as the perfect couple for the cameras, but there was something different now. The distance that had once existed between them was slowly closing. They were no longer just a husband and wife in name. There was a growing bond, one that neither of them could ignore. Yet, neither was willing to speak the words that hung between them. They were walking a fine line between the contract that held them together and the feelings that were beginning to surface. It was at one of these events, a lavish gala benefiting the arts, that the shift became undeniable. As they entered the grand ballroom, Mark couldn't help but notice how Eleanor's presence seemed to command the room. She was every bit the powerful woman she had always been, yet tonight, there was something softer about her. Something he hadn't seen before. As they mingled with guests, Mark felt a gentle pull toward her, an unspoken connection that made him wonder if perhaps they were both beginning to understand what it meant to be more than just a business arrangement. They eventually found a quiet corner away from the crowd, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses muffled in the background. Eleanor turned to him, her gaze steady but with a trace of uncertainty that Mark had never seen before. Mark, she said softly, I've been thinking about something. Mark's heart beat faster as he looked at her, unsure of where this conversation would go. What is it? He asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of anxiety. He had come to care for her more than he had ever intended, and now, it felt like they were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. Eleanor hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I've always been so focused on maintaining control, on keeping everything in my life organized and predictable. But with you, I don't know. I've started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I've been wrong. She paused, her eyes flickering with vulnerability. Maybe it's time for me to let go of some of that control. Mark stared at her, taken aback by the depth of her words. He had never imagined that Eleanor, the woman who had so carefully orchestrated their marriage, would ever admit to a need for something beyond the arrangement. He wanted to respond, to reassure her that he was willing to meet her halfway, but the words didn't come immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, as if offering the reassurance he couldn't find through speech. For a long moment, they stood there, hand in hand, neither of them speaking. But in that silence, Mark knew something had changed. Eleanor had opened up in a way that made him feel both honored and terrified. He had come into this marriage thinking it was just a way to secure his future, but now, it was starting to feel like the beginning of something more complex and something he didn't fully understand. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what this, whatever it is between us, means. But I do know that I don't want to keep pretending. Not anymore. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her eyes searching his for some kind of answer. Mark swallowed hard, his emotions swirling inside him. For so long, he had told himself that this marriage was just a means to an end, a way to protect his family and secure his future. But standing here now, with Eleanor looking at him the way she did, he realized that he had begun to care for her in a way he hadn't anticipated. He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what this means either," he said, his hand tightening around hers, "but I'm willing to figure it out with you. Whatever this is, I'm not backing away from it." Eleanor's face softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a genuine smile. It wasn't one of the practiced smiles she wore for the cameras or the press. It was real. It was full of hope and something else he couldn't quite name. The tension between them seemed to lift, replaced by an unspoken understanding. As the evening continued, Mark and Eleanor drifted through the gala, their movements more synchronized now, as if the weight of the contract that had once defined their relationship was no longer the only thing keeping them together. They laughed more freely, their interactions no longer just for show. And though neither of them said it aloud, the connection they shared now felt real, something that went beyond the contract, beyond the business arrangement. By the time the gala was over, Mark and Eleanor were no longer just husband and wife in name. They had begun to understand what it truly meant to be partners in this arrangement and perhaps, in the future, in something more. But that night, as they drove home together, neither of them could deny that the life they had agreed to live was no longer just about surviving. It was about building something new, something that neither of them had ever expected. End of Part 5. As the days passed, the bond between Mark and Eleanor continued to grow, though neither of them knew exactly how to define it. The shift that had begun at the gala's unspoken connection, the way their lives seemed to have intertwined, felt more real now, but still, they both struggled with the unspoken tension that lingered between them. They were no longer just playing the roles. They had agreed to something more, something deeper, was developing. But the question still hung in the air: was it truly love, or was it just the comfort of a connection they had both grown accustomed to? One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for a private dinner at one of her favorite spots, a quiet, intimate restaurant tucked away from the hustle of the city. Mark had become more accustomed to her world, the world of fine dining and high society, but tonight felt different. The restaurant was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold, polished atmosphere of the events they typically attended. It was just the two of them, no distractions, no cameras. Just two people, sitting across from each other, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of calm that had been missing from his life for years. As they sat down, Eleanor smiled at him, her gaze soft. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "What's on your mind, Mark?" Mark paused for a moment, unsure of how to express what he was feeling. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. It was about something else, something that was starting to feel real. But how could he put that into words? He had spent so much of his life hiding behind responsibilities, behind the idea of what he should do, that he wasn't sure he even knew how to express what he truly wanted. He took a deep breath, meeting her eyes. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice steady but hesitant, "about us. When I agreed to this contract, I thought I was just doing what was necessary, what I had to do. But I've realized that it's not just a contract anymore. It's something more." Eleanor didn't say anything immediately, but her expression softened. She looked at him as if waiting for him to continue, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her glass. Mark could see the glimmer of something behind her usually composed exterior, a flicker of emotion that mirrored his own uncertainty. He leaned forward slightly, the words finally spilling out. "I don't know when it happened, but I think I've started to care about you. Not just because of the contract, not just because of everything we've built together for the sake of appearances, but because of you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And I know I'm not supposed to feel this way. I know I'm not supposed to let this go beyond what we agreed to, but I can't help it anymore." For a long moment, Eleanor remained silent, her gaze fixed on him, her expression unreadable. Mark held his breath, unsure of what would come next. Had he just ruined everything? Had he pushed her too far? Then, to his surprise, Eleanor reached across the table, her hand gently resting on his. The touch was unexpected, but it felt like the simplest, most honest gesture between them. "Mark," she said softly, her voice filled with something deeper than he had ever heard before. "I think I've been trying to convince myself that this was all just about the contract too. But I can't ignore what's happening either." Mark's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as he listened. This wasn't just her acknowledging his feelings, this was her admitting that she, too, had started to feel the same way. And in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both in the same place now, feeling the same things, even if they didn't fully understand what it meant. They sat there for a moment, their hands intertwined, the quiet of the restaurant enveloping them. Mark wasn't sure where this would go or what it meant for their future, but for the first time, he felt as if he wasn't just playing a part. He wasn't just fulfilling a role in a business arrangement. He was here, with Eleanor, because something real had begun to form between them. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt as though he could finally breathe. He didn't need to have all the answers right now. All he needed to do was be present. "So, what now?" Mark asked, breaking the silence, his voice laced with a mix of uncertainty and hope. Eleanor smiled, a gentle, almost imperceptible smile that made Mark's heart swell. "Now," she said, squeezing his hand, "now we figure out what comes next. Together." End of part 6. The next few days felt like a strange limbo, as Mark and Eleanor tried to navigate this new territory between them. They were still attending events, still fulfilling the roles they had committed to, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them. The walls that had once separated them, those walls built of obligation and contract, were starting to come down. They no longer just shared a business arrangement. There was something more now, something neither of them could ignore, but neither of them knew how to fully embrace. It wasn't until one particularly quiet evening that things started to shift. They were sitting together on the couch in their apartment, both tired from the day's events. Eleanor, usually composed and in control, seemed unusually distant, her mind elsewhere. Mark, sensing the change, turned to her, a question lingering in his mind. "Eleanor," he began, his voice soft but steady, "what are we doing? I know we've talked about this, but I still don't know if this thing between us is real. I mean, we both know what brought us together, but I can't ignore what's been growing between us. Can you?" For a long moment, Eleanor didn't answer. She just stared at her hands in her lap, her fingers tapping lightly against the fabric of her dress. Mark watched her, his heart beating a little faster with each passing second. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe an explanation, maybe some reassurance, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "Mark," she said quietly, "I've spent my life keeping control, keeping my emotions in check. But when I look at you now, I can't deny that I care. And maybe it's not just about the contract. Maybe it's about us, about what we're becoming." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He could see it in her eyes, the truth that she had been hiding, the same truth he had been trying to ignore. This wasn't just a contract anymore. There was something real here, something that neither of them had anticipated when they had first entered this arrangement. But the weight of the situation still hung over them. What would this mean for their lives? For their future? "I've never been good at this," Mark said, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to be open. But I want to try. With you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile, and she moved closer to him, her hand resting gently on his. "You don't have to know everything," she said softly. "We're figuring it out together. And that's enough for now." They sat there, in the quiet of the apartment, their hands intertwined. For the first time, Mark felt as if he was not just playing a part in someone else's story. He wasn't just a dutiful husband or the man bound by contract. He was Mark, someone who, for the first time in a long time, was beginning to let himself feel something real. The evening passed quietly, but Mark knew things had changed between them. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. It wasn't about fulfilling obligations. It was about what was growing between them, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. They still had a long way to go. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, it didn't matter. They were in it together, and that was enough. End of part 7. The following week brought a calm that felt almost unreal to Mark. The contract that had once defined every part of his relationship with Eleanor now felt like a distant formality. They were still bound by it on paper, but emotionally, they had crossed that invisible line long ago. There was a warmth in their interactions now, an ease that had not existed before. When Eleanor smiled at him, it no longer felt like a calculated gesture for public appearances. It felt genuine. It felt real, and for the first time since this entire arrangement began, Mark allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, what they had was turning into something true. One afternoon, Eleanor invited Mark to accompany her to the company's main headquarters for an important board meeting. It was supposed to be routine, just another appearance to uphold their public image. But when they walked into the glass-walled conference room filled with executives, Mark immediately sensed the tension. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of unspoken hostility that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Eleanor, ever composed, greeted everyone with her usual grace, but even she seemed on edge. As the meeting began, it became clear why. One of the senior board members, a sharp-tongued man named Victor Haynes, had decided to question Eleanor's recent decisions, implying that her marriage to Mark was nothing more than a publicity stunt. His words were dripping with accusation, his tone cold and cutting. "Tell us, Mrs. Brooks," he said with a condescending smile, "was marrying a struggling law student part of your long-term business strategy, or simply an act of desperation?" The room fell silent. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. Every eye in the room was now on them, waiting for Eleanor's response. She took a deep breath, her expression calm but her eyes steely with determination. "My personal life is not up for discussion, Victor," she said firmly. "But if you must know, I married Mark because I believed in partnership, in loyalty, and in integrity. Qualities that, it seems, some people here have forgotten." Mark's chest tightened. He could feel her words hitting deeper than the surface. She wasn't just defending him, she was defending what they had built together, even if it had begun as an arrangement. He could see the subtle tremor in her hands, the tension she was fighting to control. Without thinking, Mark reached over and rested his hand gently on hers, a silent gesture of support. The room seemed to still at the sight, the moment unexpectedly human and raw. Victor looked away, clearly uncomfortable. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. Eleanor had reasserted her control, and when it finally ended, the tension slowly began to dissipate. As the executives filed out, Mark stayed behind, watching Eleanor gather her papers with quiet composure. She looked tired, but there was also a glint of something else in her eyes, something almost like gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly as he approached her. "Defend me like that in front of them." Mark shook his head. "I didn't do it because I had to," he replied. "I did it because I wanted to." For a moment, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, small, genuine, and filled with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm not used to having someone stand by me like that." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "Well, you're not alone anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not as long as I'm here." As they left the building together, Eleanor reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his in a simple, unspoken act of connection. The contract might have brought them together, but it was trust and perhaps something deeper that was keeping them there now. And in that moment, walking side by side beneath the setting sun, Mark realized that he was no longer trapped in a life that wasn't his own. He had found something real, something worth fighting for. And for the first time, Eleanor seemed to believe it too. End of Part 8. The weeks that followed the board meeting brought new challenges and changes, but there was a new sense of strength between Mark and Eleanor. They had faced the pressure, both from the outside world and from their own hearts, and they had come through it stronger than before. The walls that had once separated them, the formalities and business arrangements, had given way to something more meaningful. They had discovered that the partnership they had entered into for security and convenience had, over time, become something far deeper, a genuine bond built on trust, respect, and, yes, even love. One evening, as they sat together in their apartment after a quiet dinner, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes thoughtful. "Mark," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about how far we've come. I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect us to be like this." She paused, her gaze never leaving his. "I didn't expect to want this. But now that it's here, I'm glad it is." Mark felt a warmth in his chest at her words. He had come to realize that he didn't just want this new life, he needed it. With Eleanor, he wasn't just playing a role anymore. He wasn't just her business partner or the man she had married out of necessity. He was someone she cared for, and that meant everything to him. He reached for her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. I didn't expect this either, he admitted, his voice low and sincere. But I can't imagine my life without you. I've been living my life in survival mode for so long, just going through the motions. But now, with you, it feels like I'm finally living. For a moment, Eleanor was silent, her eyes soft as she gazed at him. It was as if she, too, was realizing the truth of what they had built together. This wasn't just about two people who had found themselves trapped in a contract anymore. It was about a life they had chosen to create together, one that went beyond the limits of their initial agreement. I think we've been given something special, Eleanor said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. We didn't plan for this. We didn't expect it. But somehow, we've made it work. And I don't want to let it go. Mark squeezed her hand gently, the weight of her words settling over him like a comforting embrace. Neither do I, he said, his heart swelling with a sense of certainty. I think we've built something real here. Something worth holding on to. The words lingered in the air between them, but there was no need to say anything else. They both knew what had been unspoken. The life they had created together wasn't just an arrangement. It wasn't just a contract. It was love, something they had found in the most unexpected of places, and something they were both ready to embrace fully. Later that week, as they prepared for another gala, this time a private charity event, Mark looked over at Eleanor as she adjusted her dress in front of the mirror. She caught his eye and smiled, her expression full of warmth and understanding. You ready for this? She asked, her voice teasing but soft. Mark smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in years. I'm ready, he said simply. But only because I'm with you. The gala went smoothly, as they both expected, but this time it felt different. They moved through the room together, not just as husband and wife, but as partners in a life they had both chosen. The crowd cheered for them, but they didn't need the applause anymore. They had everything they needed in each other, and in that moment, it wasn't just about the charity, the cameras, or the contracts. It was about the love they had built together, something that neither of them could have predicted when they first met. The night ended quietly, just the two of them walking hand in hand, leaving the event behind. And as they stepped into the cool night air, Mark realized that this moment, this life they had created was all he had ever really wanted. He didn't need a contract to define what they had. All he needed was Eleanor, and the promise they had made to each other, no matter what. End of part 9.